So thank you, Erin, for that great video. And as you've seen just now, we are kicking off a new series this morning called Stories for Life. And we're looking at some of the stories that Jesus told in the Gospels and how they apply to our lives. Today we're looking at the wonderful story of the lost son, sometimes called the Prodigal Son, in Luke chapter 15. And at the start of the chapter, we read that the tax collectors and sinners were gathering around to hear Jesus. And these were people on the margins of society, those who were unpopular, those who were considered in their society to be lost. And they clearly found something compelling and attractive about Jesus and hung around him, ate with him, wanted to spend time with him. And in verse 2, we read that the Pharisees and the teachers of the law were muttering amongst themselves, "This man welcomes sinners and eats with them." And so Jesus answers their criticism by telling these three parables or stories to explain his actions and to make them feel a little bit uncomfortable about their muttering. Jesus starts by telling a story about a shepherd who has 100 sheep, and one of those sheep wanders off. And so the shepherd leaves the 99 and goes to find and rescue that lost sheep. And when he finds that sheep, there's great joy and a celebration. The second story is of a woman who has 10 precious coins. And one of these coins gets lost and she turns her house upside down and she looks everywhere for this coin. She doesn't stop until she finds it. And when she finds it, she throws a party. And the third story, the one we're looking at today, is of a lost son. All three stories share a pattern in the way in which they're told. Something's lost, something's found, and then there's a great celebration. Jesus is saying that him eating and celebrating is a replica of what is happening in heaven. If heaven is celebrating, then why should these Pharisees and these teachers of the law not also be celebrating? Likewise, when we celebrate, when the lost are found, when those on the margins of society find Jesus and his embrace, we are joining in with what is happening in heaven. And so we're going to be looking at this third story together and thinking about three characters that Jesus describes. The first son who runs off, the father, and the older, dutiful son who stays at home with his dad. Now, this is Rembrandt's picture that depicts the scene as described in the painting The Return of the Prodigal Son. And there's a brilliant book by Henri Nguyen by the same title you might want to look up. The first character is the younger son of this wealthy man. And we read that this son asks for his inheritance early. In verse 12 it says, "Father, give me my share of the estate." Now, according to Jewish custom, property was passed down from father to son, with the first son being entitled to twice the amount given to any other sons. And so this man with two sons would give 2/3 of his estate to the oldest son and the remaining third to his second. Now, what's shocking is that the son is asking his father to give him his share of the estate whilst his dad is still alive. In requesting what should become available only on his father's death, this son is in effect writing his father's death certificate. He's saying, "I'd rather you were dead because I want your money." In ancient Jewish society, that would be virtually unforgivable. What's equally shocking is how the father responds to this request. He was well within his rights to tell the son where to go, but that would have made what was likely to be a tricky father-son relationship much worse. And instead, the father opts for a more extraordinary and difficult option. The one remaining way was for his son to have the way open to him coming back to the Father. This father chooses to give the son what he's asked for. It says in verse 12 that the father divides his property between them. And what does this younger son do? Not only does he turn his back on his family, but he then turns his back on his Jewish heritage as well. He takes this cash and he goes to a non-Jewish land and blows it all on wild living. And once all the money is gone and his friends quickly leave him thereafter, he finds himself in a desperate situation. He's feeding pigs and he's longing even to eat the food of those pigs. Earlier on in our Lego story, we had Lego horses. I guess Lego pigs are slightly hard to come by in the Lego world. It's an important detail though, because for a Jew, this was the lowest of low points to reach. And so the son hatches a plan to go back to his father and ask to be just like one of his father's hired servants. His once fine robes here are in tatters, his feet are dishevelled, his shoes are worn, his head is shorn. He's in a humble state. And we've all been there in one form or another in our lives. We've all had times of wanting what God can give us, but not wanting God himself. We've all chosen instant gratification, pursued things that we think would make our lives better, that would give us a good time or help us to feel more fulfilled on the inside, only to find that they leave us feeling empty and broken. Temptation has led us down a path where we now feel dirty, unfulfilled. And the party this boy has leaves him feeling empty and lonely. Notice how the party the boy has leaves him without friends. Whereas the celebrations that Jesus has are full of community, full of people. And sooner or later we realise that we have made a mistake. The danger is that in that place we stay away from God. We think that we can't go back to him. We feel too guilty or too ashamed. But this son decides to go back and discovers what he probably already knew, that his father would forgive him. Now let's think about the father in the story. While he was still a long way off, his father saw him and was filled with compassion for him. He ran to his son, threw his arms around him and kissed him. This is before the days when running was a thing. The elders of that time wouldn't run. It was undignified. It was a shocking thing. And yet here the father runs whilst he sees his son even a long way off. Not to give his son a piece of his own mind, but to embrace him and to kiss him, to reinstate him. The son commences his speech that I'm sure he'd rehearsed on the long trek home. But before he can get too far into it, he's cut off. And this image of running and kissing in forgiveness occurs only once elsewhere in the Bible. You may remember that story of Jacob's reconciliation with his brother Esau in Genesis 33. So remarkable was Esau's response to Jacob that he believed he had seen the face of God. And so it is here with this younger brother. Both he and Jacob were accosted by grace. And grace is the face of God. In our story this morning, instead of disowning the son, the father distinguishes him. He orders that robes are brought and new sandals are put on his feet, a ring be put on his fingers and a calf be slaughtered for a celebration. And this is the moment Rembrandt here is capturing, a picture of grace and forgiveness. The moment of forgiveness where the father welcomes back his son without reservation. Now, this is how the Father in heaven reacts when we return to him. We can remember that there's a Father who's always watching out for us, waiting for us to come home. But this isn't where the story finishes. And meanwhile, the elder son is in the field. The older son hasn't gone anywhere. He's wearing his red robe that indicates his wealth and his status. But he's staying away from these celebrations, in a field somewhere in a huff. He may not have ran off, but on the inside he was really lost. He never left his father, but his father had never thrown a big festival or a big celebration for him. This son was going through the motions of doing all the right stuff, but on the inside being eaten away with anger and bitterness and rage. And looking at the way his hands are folded in judgment against his brother tells you something. You know, if you were in the older brother's sandals, would you accept your brother home and celebrate with him and with the father? Or would you be like this son, worried about yourself and too worried about what's happened to you to share in the joy of this son's return? You know, that might not quite be your circumstances today. But maybe you've been serving your heart out for others, maybe in church or at home or in the workplace. Outwardly, you continue to do the right thing, but on the inside, frustration and annoyance gnaws away at you. You feel unnoticed and unappreciated, passed over. But notice Jesus' point in this context of these three stories. Heaven is celebrating. And so, you know, the challenge to the Pharisees and to us is, shouldn't we also be celebrating too? And as a church, we want to celebrate with Jesus, being careful to deal early with resentment or any bitterness that might get in the way and rob us of sharing in the party. You know, we don't want to put obstacles in front of people, but show them that the same grace that God has shown each one of us is available to them. Well, it's a story that keeps asking questions, and in your homes or in your small groups this week, why don't you consider the following questions? Who do you most identify with, the younger or the older son, and why? Secondly, how have you experienced God's grace and forgiveness in your life? And lastly, how can we extend God's generous love to those in our community? Now, in a moment, we're going to worship together in song, but first I want us to pray together. Lord, I thank you for this amazing story that Jesus told, that's a picture for each one of us, of your desire to reach out to each one of us in our lostness. I pray for those this morning who need to return to you today. May we come and find your embrace again. And where we've outwardly kept up appearances but find ourselves lost on the inside, would we choose not to stay on the outside of the party, but to draw near to you again and experience the celebration and the joy of lost things being found. Amen. And let's worship together.